the untold story of desperate decisions, strategic deceptions, and the slow implosion of an empire that refused to accept defeat. The wind over Tokyo carried no songs anymore, only dust, ash, and the faint echo of a nation's heartbeat, slowing into silence. Beneath the crimson banners that once promised eternity, the empire of the rising sun was beginning to sink, not under the weight of foreign armies, but under the slow fracture of its own soul. The night sky glowed red, long before the bombs ever reached it. The fires that consumed Japan in the summer of 1945 were not born of explosions alone, but of exhaustion, disbelief, and quiet despair. Inside the corridors of power, men in immaculate uniforms whispered to one another without raising their eyes. Outside, the people no longer whispered at all. They had learned that silence was safer. Tokyo was a city of ghosts long before Hiroshima. The air itself carried the scent of burned rice and melted tin. Neighborhoods once alive with the sound of children and merchants now existed, only in memory, flattened by the American B-29s that circled above like patient predators. In the imperial palace, the blinds were drawn to hide the smoke drifting over the horizon. Even the emperor's garden, where cherry blossoms once symbolized renewal, was littered with the gray dust of a dying world. And yet, in meetings behind sealed doors, the generals still spoke of victory. They spoke of spirit, of the divine wind kamikaze that would save them when steel and logic could not. Their words, spoken through clenched teeth, echoed the same conviction that had built their empire. That will could defeat reality. That sacrifice could replace strategy. That death was preferable to surrender. But reality had already invaded their sanctuaries. It came not with gunfire, but with hunger. In the city's ration cards turned into blank paper. Mothers stood in lines that never ended, waiting for rice that never came. Farmers hid their harvests from the government collectors, knowing that loyalty could no longer fill a stomach. The empire's arteries, the supply lines, the convoys, the factories, had turned brittle. Every machine that still worked screamed louder than a man could pray. In the military headquarters at Ichigaya, the atmosphere thickened with doubt. Some officers argued for negotiation. Others whispered of a coup to protect the emperor from weak minds. But none dared to say aloud what everyone knew. Japan was already defeated, even if no one had yet signed the word. The shadow of Saipan hung over every meeting. When that island fell in 1944, it wasn't just a strategic loss, it was a revelation. For the first time, the Japanese mainland lay within reach of American bombers. The war that had once stretched across oceans was now at the nation's doorstep. From Saipan came the raids, hundreds of planes, glinting in the sunlight, their engines humming like the pulse of some mechanical god. They dropped not only bombs but the truth. The illusion of invincibility had ended. Still, inside the army ministry, logic remained chained to honor. General Anami, grim and unbending, refused to speak of surrender. He believed that even in annihilation, Japan must remain pure. Others, like Foreign Minister Teiji, saw the abyss and trembled. He met with diplomats in secrecy, attempting to use the Soviet Union as a bridge for peace. But time was running out, and so was the empire's strength. Factories stood half empty. The young men who once shouted patriotic songs were buried beneath coral sands or rusting in ships beneath the Pacific. The Air Force was a shadow, wooden planes, half-trained pilots, dwindling fuel. And yet, propaganda films still showed smiling soldiers, their eyes bright with duty. The cameras never filmed the hospitals, where the wounded were stacked in corridors, or the children who learned to bow toward the emperor while coughing from the smoke of the burned cities. The home front became a mirror of quiet madness. Schoolgirls carried bamboo spears. Housewives melted pots and pans into bullets that would never be fired. Civilians dug trenches around temples, convinced they would defend them against invasion. But the invasion had already begun, not from the sea, but from within. It was despair, disguised as duty. At night, the radio played soft music, interrupted by official voices promising decisive victory. People listened in silence, their faces lit by the orange glow of fires on the horizon. They no longer believed the words, but disbelief was dangerous. So they nodded to the air, bowed to the static, and went back to sweeping ashes from their doorsteps. In the depths of the imperial palace, Emperor Hirohito walked through the hall of chrysanthemums, his white gloves immaculate, his expression unreadable. Those who saw him up close said he moved like a ghost, a man both present and absent. He read reports of devastation and signed decrees of endurance. He was the symbol of eternity, forced to watch time collapse around him. By the spring of 1945, the empire's final illusion shattered. Okinawa had fallen. Nearly 100,000 Japanese soldiers died defending it, along with countless civilians, mothers with children, priests, students. The sea turned black with oil and red with blood. American warships filled the horizon like a moving city, their guns a reminder that the Pacific had been lost long ago. The kamikaze were born not of courage, but of inevitability. Young men, barely old enough to shave, lined up for missions they knew would end in fire. They were told their deaths would save Japan. In truth, they were meant to delay the end, to buy a few more weeks of dignity for a collapsing dream. Letters written in careful calligraphy spoke of honor, of loyalty, of love for the emperor. But between the lines, there was fear. Every pilot knew what the generals refused to say. The empire was crumbling faster than faith could rebuild it. And yet, amid this ruin, the machinery of control continued. Censors erased the word defeat from newspapers. Teachers told children that the gods would send storms to protect the homeland. The army swore to defend the emperor to the last breath, even if that meant turning their weapons inward. Then, in July, a cable arrived from Potsdam. It offered Japan one last chance to surrender unconditionally. The council debated. Some urged acceptance, others demanded defiance. They chose silence instead. The message went unanswered. The war continued, not because of strategy, but because no one dared to be the first to speak the word end. In the days that followed, the fires grew. Entire neighborhoods of Tokyo were erased in a single night of incendiary bombing. Witnesses said the wind itself caught fire, sweeping through wooden homes like a living creature. Thousands suffocated, not from smoke, but from the vacuum of oxygen burned from the air. Those who survived carried the memory of a sky that glowed brighter than dawn, a city that had turned into a furnace. Still, the war went on. Still, the silence held. In August, something new arrived, something that would end not just the war, but the illusion of control over death itself. Yet even before the bombs fell, Japan had already imploded. The empire's heart had stopped beating long before Hiroshima burned. In the final meetings, the generals' eyes were hollow. The maps before them no longer marked territory. They marked denial. The emperor, finally speaking in his own voice, broke the silence that had consumed his nation. His words, carried through the radio in tones almost divine, admitted the unthinkable. The war must end. For many, it was the first time they had ever heard his voice. For others, it was the sound of their world ending. When the announcement reached the streets, some knelt in tears. Others screamed in disbelief. Soldiers drew their swords and ended their own lives before accepting shame. And in the ruins of Tokyo, mothers held their children close and whispered, "It's over," though no one truly understood what that meant. The empire had not been conquered. It had collapsed, slowly, silently, from within. The bombs were only the final punctuation to a story already written in hunger, pride, and exhaustion. When the smoke cleared, Japan stood at the edge of something new. The chrysanthemum, scorched and fragile, would bloom again, not from triumph, but from remembrance. And for those who had lived through the fire, one truth remained. The greatest destruction had not come from the skies, but from the refusal to see that no empire, no matter how divine, can outlast the weight of its own denial. The wind over Tokyo carried no songs anymore, only the memory of a nation that had finally fallen silent, and the faint whisper of what it might one day become.